Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Backxwash record, His Happiness Shall Come First Even Though We Are Suffering. His Happiness Shall Come First Even Though We Are Suffering is the latest studio album from the Canadian experimental rapper Backxwash, an individual who is easily one of the most intense MCs in the entirety of hip-hop globally at the moment, and also, perhaps more importantly, this is the third studio album in a trilogy of albums, as well as, of course, being a trilogy, the final record in that series. Said trilogy initially began with the record God Has Nothing to Do with This, Leave Him Out of It, and was followed up by the somewhat even more acclaimed I Lie Here Buried with My Rings and My Dresses. And now, here we are, third installment in the Backxwash trilogy of albums, and despite the fact that those two aforementioned records are slightly flawed to varying extents, it seems like she has ditched the vast majority of the flaws for her latest studio album to make what may be her best work to date. First of all, as an actual rapper, Backxwash is extremely intense, as she really does walk this sort of line between industrial hip-hop, horrorcore, and a bunch of other subgenres of rap that really just implies that she's mixing together most of the heavily abrasive sides of the genre, and that ultimately creates a dark and uncomfortable soup that you just kind of have to sit in throughout the entirety of any given Backxwash album, and that may not be the most appealing thing for certain people, but it certainly suits her delivery style and lyrical style, something I'll touch on in a moment, and delivery style especially between the actual genuine, normal, straightforward hip-hop flows found here or there, or the industrial metal-esque screaming that she does over certain tracks. It all just suits the sound and vibe that she's going for as far as atmosphere goes on her latest studio album. In fact, I would actually go as far as to argue that His Happiness Shall Come First is maybe the best outing that we've gotten from Backxwash thus far in terms of actual performance and memorable delivery. Much of this success can be accredited to her putting a bit more restraint on her voice this time around, and for a lot of musicians and a lot of artists and groups that sort of dabble within the same realm of experimental slash alternative hip-hop, that would be a bad thing. That would be something that would imply a less direct listening experience and something not as memorable. But the opposite is actually true for Backxwash, as one of her greatest issues as a performer and throughout the entirety of her backlog of a discography is that she kind of loses control a little bit here or there. She kind of sort of loses control over her voice. She just goes into these impassioned but directionless vocalizations and flows and even ramblings from time to time. And while they can be charming here or there, it does occasionally happen a little bit too often for its own good, which results in a weaker work overall. But here, she puts a bit more restraint on her voice so that she never loses any of the fire that she's had for multiple albums now, while at the same time never totally going off the rails even once throughout the entirety of this record. If you are a Backxwash fan and you're somewhat afraid of this album sounding a bit less immediate, a bit less impassioned, maybe a bit less determined to get this very abrasive and uncomfortable but genuine sound across like she has on prior records, then there's no need to be afraid, because she still does here. It's just done in a slightly more self-contained manner, which ultimately results in a finer and more refined album overall. Like prior Backxwash albums, His Happiness Shall Come First greatly relies on a very powerful lyrical style that is distinctly Backxwash and nobody else's, and it's just as uncomfortable but striking, direct, and as genuine as it's ever been. In fact, the lines, "Tell Uncle Abel I miss him, tell Dad he's forgiven, I'll never talk to him, but with all the sadness and wisdom, tell my homies I love them, even though I don't trust them," which comes from the album closer Mukazi, kind of sums up the record in a way. This album is a part of a trilogy that saw Backxwash take a look at her life starting from present and working backwards, and being the final album in said trilogy, she has examined her entire existence at this point, and she can do nothing else but forgive and move on with her own life as she looks forward to the future, the next project that she goes through with making, the next challenge that she endures as a person. And I think in a way that's the bravest thing, or at least one of the bravest things that any of us can do as people, and to have it in such a brilliant form musically is just really nice to see, really nice to listen to, and really nice to have despite the uncomfortable and unnerving qualities of Backxwash's music. And that's because despite its bleak and confrontational feel with lyrical topics of familial tensions, suicide, and a variety of other things that are less than pleasant to directly talk about for most artists, this is an album that's about transition and it's about personal growth. And I think at its heart, it's a record that is deeply beautiful, just one that isn't to be taken lightly, and it realizes that and does so in projecting itself through a violent and often uncomfortable, disturbing, again, unnerving filter. Again, this is all just my own examination of this record, but nonetheless, my point stands. It's that this is an album that I think will be off-putting for some people. It's an album that will definitely be off-putting for a lot of people, actually, most likely, with the amount of ground that it covers in terms of disturbing topics that, again, are just uncomfortable for a lot of people to directly discuss and talk about, a lot of topics that have social stigmas around them, but at the same time, Backxwash approaches them with such honesty, but with a sense of grace and even poetry in her lyricism that not only do I think she deserves more credit for what she's doing here, but just in general, this record solidifies her as an absolutely amazing lyricist and one of the best confrontationalists in the entirety of not only hip-hop, but music in general at the moment. So overall, His Happiness Shall Come First, Even Though We Are Suffering, is just a brilliant album, and it's one that, despite its cold, bleak, and violent qualities, I do genuinely think this is a beautiful and even moving album, and I highly recommend it even if you haven't heard it. I know that sounds weird to say, I highly recommend it even if you haven't heard it, but at the same time, Backxwash is one of those artists that's kind of hard to recommend to anybody, even intense, hardcore, experimental hip-hop fans, because she really does make music that's significantly more confrontational than anything that you'll ever get from an act like, say, Death Grips, for example. I mean, sure, an act like Death Grips is super intense from a musical standpoint. I love them dearly, too, for that exact reason, but rarely do you get that 1-2 sort of combo of intense, grim lyricism and intense, grim instrumentals that are just really insanely chaotic except very well produced. It all kind of comes together extremely well despite the fact that it's all insane. It really is just an album that needs to be heard to be understood, so I recommend it even if you haven't heard it, and I say that because this is the kind of album that is just really impossible to properly recommend. So overall, I'm going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this review. I have been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.